1 week is not a symbolic milestone. The clinical data for the 168-hour mark is specific. Approximately 50% of surplus nicotinic acetylcholine receptors have been pruned. The molecular dismantling of the receptor infrastructure of the addiction is half complete. Dopamine synthesis is at 80 to 85% of pre-cessation baseline. Cravings average 3 per day, each lasting 2 to 3 minutes rather than the 3 to 5 of day 1. Sleep architecture is normalizing. Every major organ system, cardiovascular, pulmonary, immune, metabolic, endocrine, has begun measurable recovery. But there is one change happening on day 7 that is distinct from the biochemical and physiological data points. It's a neural event in a specific region of the brain, and it is documented in neuroimaging research. The medial prefrontal cortex, the seat of self-referential processing, the network where the brain maintains its concept of who you are, is beginning to encode a different self-model, one that does not include nicotine as a defining feature. This is the neuroscience of identity. And it begins on day 7. This video covers hours 145 through 168, every hour of the final day of the first week. Hour 145. Nicotinic acetylcholine receptor density is approaching 50% normalization. The specific receptor subtype most relevant here is alpha-4-beta-2, the most abundant nicotinic receptor in the brain and the primary target of nicotine addiction. Its degradation is occurring through the ubiquitin proteasome pathway, the same cellular machinery that breaks down damaged or surplus proteins throughout the body. Each degraded receptor is one less binding site demanding nicotine. The receptor architecture of the addiction is being dismantled by your own cellular biology. At hour 146, bronchial cilia are beating at approximately 8 to 10 Hz, up from 4 to 6 Hz at the start of the neurological rewire phase. Normal ciliary beat frequency is 12 to 15 Hz. Mucociliary clearance velocity is approximately 60 to 70% of normal. The mucociliary escalator, which was near zero during active vaping, has rebuilt most of its functional capacity in 1 week. Coughing may be less frequent now, and breathing during routine activity may feel noticeably less effortful. Hour 147, glycemic control has stabilized. Fasting blood glucose and postprandial insulin responses are within normal physiological ranges. Pancreatic beta cell recovery from nicotine-induced oxidative stress is well underway. Energy levels should feel more predictable throughout the day. Fewer unexplained crashes or surges than the first 4 days of withdrawal. At hour 148, dopamine levels in the nucleus accumbens are now approximately 80 to 85% of pre-cessation baseline. The combination of increasing tyrosine hydroxylase activity and upregulated D2 receptor density means the brain's reward system is approaching functional competence for natural reward processing. Small pleasures, a good meal, a warm shower, a conversation you actually enjoy, are registering as genuinely pleasurable for the first time in a week. Hour 149. Morning cortisol levels are within 5 to 10% of pre-cessation baseline. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, negative feedback loop, mediated by hippocampal glucocorticoid receptors, has largely recalibrated. Stress reactivity is normalizing. Situations that felt overwhelming on days 2 and 3 are becoming manageable. The physiological alarm response to stressors is becoming more proportionate. Hour 150. GABA to glutamate balance in the prefrontal cortex and limbic system is approaching homeostasis. Restored inhibitory GABAergic tone reestablishes the brain's ability to modulate excitatory signals, the mechanism by which appropriate emotional regulation occurs. The free-floating anxiety of the first 4 days of withdrawal, which was a direct consequence of the excitatory-inhibitory imbalance, has largely resolved. Background anxiety has diminished to a level that feels manageable. At hour 151, salivary enzyme concentrations are normalizing. Salivary amylase, which begins carbohydrate digestion in the mouth, and lysozyme, an antimicrobial enzyme that forms part of the oral mucosal immune defense, had both been disrupted by direct toxic effects of propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin aerosol on salivary gland acinar cells. Their normalization means both improved digestion initiation and improved oral antimicrobial protection. Hour 152. Sleep efficiency, the ratio of time asleep to time spent in bed, is approaching the normal range of 85 to 90%. The proportion of time in each sleep stage is rebalancing. N1 light sleep is decreasing, N3 deep slow wave sleep is increasing, and REM rebound intensity is beginning to taper as the accumulated sleep debt from the first week is gradually repaid. The sleep architecture of a non-nicotine user is reasserting itself. At hour 153, craving frequency has reached approximately 3 per day. Each episode is 2 to 3 minutes in duration, shorter than the 3 to 5 minutes of acute withdrawal. Peak intensity is lower. The insula, the brain region that generates the interoceptive experience of craving, is being more effectively modulated by prefrontal inhibitory control. The clinical description at this point is specific. Cravings feel like distant echoes rather than urgent demands. Still present, still recognizable, but no longer controlling. Hour 154. Monocytes, the circulating immune cells that migrate to sites of infection and tissue damage, have recovered normal chemotactic and phagocytic function. Nicotine had impaired monocyte migration through alpha-7 nicotinic receptor-mediated inhibition. With that pathway deactivated, your innate immune system's first responder capability is restored. You are less susceptible to infections today than you were at any point during active use. At hour 155, working memory performance is recovering toward pre-cessation levels. The cholinergic projections from the nucleus basalis of Maynard to the prefrontal cortex are functioning more efficiently with a normalized receptor population. Working memory and the ability to hold and manipulate information in mind support sustained attention, planning, and complex problem-solving. Tasks that required constant effortful attention may now flow more naturally. Hour 156. Spirometric measurements would now show early improvement in FEV1 and forced vital capacity. Bronchial inflammation is decreasing, airway smooth muscle has relaxed to near normal caliber, and mucus clearance has substantially improved. Physical breathing capacity is noticeably improved during moderate exertion. Climbing stairs, walking quickly, any activity that previously caused earlier onset of breathlessness. At hour 157, the ventral pallidum, a critical output structure of the reward circuit, is re-establishing normal hedonic encoding. This nucleus integrates dopamine, opioid, and GABA signals to generate the subjective experience of pleasure. Its recovery is what allows natural rewards to feel rewarding again. Not just less awful than they were on day 3, but actually good. Laughter may come more easily. Social interaction may feel less like a performance and more like genuine exchange. Hour 158. Serum levels of vitamin C, vitamin E, and total antioxidant capacity are recovering. Chronic vaping had depleted these antioxidants through continuous neutralization of reactive oxygen species from aerosol inhalation. Restored antioxidant reserves protect against DNA damage and cellular aging across every tissue. The cumulative effect of this protection will compound over weeks and months. Hour 159. Systolic and diastolic blood pressure have decreased by approximately 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury from acute cessation levels. The combination of restored endothelial nitric oxide production, reduced sympathetic tone, and declining catecholamine levels is producing sustained hemodynamic improvement. If you measure your blood pressure today and compare it to what it was when you were actively using, the numbers will be different. This is not subjective. It is measurable cardiovascular change. At hour 160, taste sensitivity is now functional across all 5 modalities: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. New taste receptor cells that have never been exposed to vaping aerosol chemicals are the majority on your tongue. Gustatory cortex signal interpretation is recalibrating to a cleaner sensory input. Food should taste noticeably more complex and vivid than it did a week ago. This is not adaptation to the absence of something. It is sensory recovery. Hour 161. Microglial activation in the brain is decreasing. Microglia, the brain's resident immune cells, had adopted a pro-inflammatory phenotype during chronic nicotine exposure and its withdrawal. Their return to a surveilling non-reactive state reduces the neuroinflammatory cytokine production that has been contributing to brain fog throughout this week. The persistent cognitive fog of days 3 through 5 is lifting. Thoughts are becoming clearer. Cognitive sequencing, the ability to move from one thought to the next in a structured way, is improving. At hour 162, bronchial inflammation is measurably resolving. Eosinophil and neutrophil counts in bronchoalveolar lavage fluid are declining toward normal ranges. The airway inflammatory infiltrate caused by chronic vaping aerosol exposure is clearing, and the bronchial epithelial barrier function is strengthening with each passing day. Hour 163. Neuroimaging studies show that by day 7, something specific begins happening in the medial prefrontal cortex. The default mode network, the brain network active during self-referential processing, when you think about yourself, your past, your future, is beginning to incorporate a non-smoker identity. This is not metaphorical. The default mode network is literally encoding a new self-concept. The patterns of neural activation that represent who you are, built over years, are being updated. The neural signature associated with smoking or vaping as a component of self-identity, I am a smoker, I vape, is losing its default mode presence. A different pattern is forming. This has a practical consequence. People who reach 7 days begin to describe themselves differently. Not, I'm trying to quit, which describes an aspiration relative to a current state, but I don't vape or I quit. Declarative identity in the present tense. This linguistic shift reflects a neural shift. The two circuits that encode these statements, aspirational future versus current identity, are different circuits. One activates under conditions of effort and resistance. The other activates as a description of a stable state. You are approaching the stable state description. And the medial prefrontal cortex is the neural substrate of that shift. 168 hours. 7 full days without nicotine. Approximately 50% of surplus nicotinic acetylcholine receptors have been pruned. Dopamine synthesis is at 80 to 85% of baseline. Cravings average 3 per day, shorter in duration, lower in intensity than any previous point in the sprint. Sleep architecture is normalizing. REM rebound is tapering. Slow-wave sleep is deepening. Every major organ system has measurable recovery and progress. The clinical literature treats 1 week as a threshold. People who reach 7 days have substantially higher rates of sustained long-term abstinence than those who make it to 4 or 5 days. This is not because the neurological work is finished at 7 days. The receptor normalization will continue for several more weeks. The dopamine system will continue recovering. It is because 1 week represents sufficient neurological adaptation that the acute withdrawal is functionally resolved. The craving burden has dropped to a manageable level. The identity shift has begun. 7 days is approximately 3,300 inhalations of toxic aerosol that did not enter your pulmonary tissue. It is 1 week of your coronary arteries producing appropriate amounts of nitric oxide. 1 week of receptor pruning. 1 week of your immune system recovering its surveillance capacity. 1 week of sleep that will, with each passing night, be increasingly restorative. The sprint has 7 more days to run. The second week is physiologically different from the first. The tissue repair phase, the continued rewiring, and the consolidation of the new identity the default mode network has begun encoding. We'll cover it hour by hour. Day 8 enters the tissue repair phase, a new named stage in the clinical timeline. The neurological rewire continues, but pulmonary tissue is now the dominant story. Ciliary regeneration, alveolar reconstruction, bronchial epithelial renewal. We'll cover what's happening in your lungs and vasculature in the second week, and why days 8 through 10